growing. Yeah, so we've got the last about 25 minutes scheduled for just kind of open back and forth. You guys don't have to hang out at the front of the room, so feel free to do whatever you like. I don't think there's any more coffee. If there is, you might get lucky. Otherwise, I'm happy to either facilitate that or just kind of let people talk into the mics or not into the mics until we get kicked out at 5. Did anybody else? Did we have anything else? No? That's all. So, I think it'd be really interesting to hear some responses to that question, especially from practitioners in other fields, people who haven't had a chance to speak to something all day, anything you're interested in, and then,
I would say, I think, okay. And I think it would also be really useful to think as a group kind of what are the concrete steps coming out of this? Like, are there particular, and there's been a lot of discussion of like, oh, it would be useful to have more guidelines on X, Y, Z. It would just be useful to think like as a group, are there particular things where we think there are steps that, that do make sense going ahead?
So I'll just talk from here then. So guidelines are, I think, the start for some of these because they're related to the transparency. And as I said earlier, everything that we do right now in terms of the checking, the complete list that my checkers get is out there. It's kind of hidden away because trying to convince the AA folks to post something very technical on their website is a bit challenging, so there's a hidden link somewhere along the guidelines at the bottom, find some further information. But everything that we check, that entire stuff, is out there. Have a look at it. And it's on GitHub, so if you want to improve it or make changes to it, do a pull request. If you don't know what that is, learn it, because that's part of the process. So we're open about that. The other thing is that it is explicitly multi-institutional. So while some of the very specific stuff that we are doing is on a site called AEA Guidance, github.io or something like that, there's also a social science editor version of that site where we started out saying let's keep it general enough because this is relevant in sociology and demography, et cetera, where maybe there's a bit more stuff to do. But we've been having this discussion among econ journals. So there's an smallish but active oligopoly, I'd like to pitch it as. My Hungarian collaborator on that says it's a guild of data editors that are coordinating on these kinds of things. We're exchanging experiences. Somewhere down the road, we might be exchanging RAs. I've got this thing that requires some funky Fortran compilation. None of my RAs know it, but you guys over at the Econometric Journal, you are doing this on a regular basis. Could you do this one for me? So there is coordination, and that's intentional because this shouldn't just be the AA guidelines. We might be the big elephant in the room. We're the ones with all the money, but this should not be just for the AA. Because I'd like you to actually have that even before you think about submission. And if you're going to have to adapt it to the AA and then do it again for the JPE and do it again for RESA, that's wrong. That just doesn't scale. And so these need to become, at worst, flavors of checklists or scenarios. So again, my Hungarian colleague thinks we should be having makefiles, and he's developing some JSON file about how you should encode which version of stuff that is. And I said, go try it, and then tell me how it works, because I think most of our researchers would be challenged. But, well, actually, he might be doing it in YAML. And if you don't know what these things are, that you're in the vast majority of social scientists. And that's part of the problem. So this is general. The guidance is out there. There's going to be coordination and convergence, hopefully, over time, over what DIME has as guidance and what JPEL has as guidance, what the A has as guidance, what RESET has as guidance, and hopefully we'll converge to something that are just variations on a theme, but that fundamentally work. And that's I think, the start.
Another topic or group that I'd love to hear if anybody has any comments is, again, the role of junior researchers, early career researchers, people who are in postdocs or non-academic tracks, how this kind of agenda has affected your education, your work, if it especially feels, or are there any positions where it feels like a burden on new people where it's taking up time where you should be doing real research, or the opposite, whether it's great and it makes your research better. I would love to hear from people who are, as Laura said, kind of after the dinosaur hump, people who are coming into the field and kind of assuming that this is going to be the way things will be, or is it terrifying? Does it seem like a upcoming prison where all you do is reproducibility work and very little work? If anybody's at that point in their lives.
So I started working at Dime about 8 months ago, and the very first thing I did when I showed up was I was told, go on the Dime Analytics Wiki, go see all of their resources, go see what's going on. And the first thing that shows up when you do that, the first presentation, is about using the IE toolkit and the whole process for that. And you take it in stride like everything else. You're learning as you're going. Once you're done with that, you go to the next step. And because it's part of that process, you don't really see it as anything new or different. It's just becomes a natural first step in whatever project you're doing. So I think, especially when you're in this process of learning how to use all of the tools in impact evaluations or other kinds of analyses that you do in development, as long as it's part of what you're being trained to do, it doesn't come off as being different or burdensome. And the structure actually helps to learn, right? Once you have those things in place, you don't have to muddle around so much for all the rest. And if you do have to muddle around, well, it's everything you guys have to do as well.
I guess kind of related to that, I would like to hear someone closer to academia about what are the efforts made to include those skills in curriculum, or because basically what has been said here, we need to put in place as incentives so people do that, but do people learn? Are people learning? The new people, the junior researchers, are they learning this in school, or is there any effort, like institutional effort, to do that?
Who here works at a university?
I guess we're missing some.
One thing I can say is, at least I know it differs in different universities, but at least at Berkeley, the rise of what's called data science, which is some combination, of computation, computer science, statistics, has been really staggering over the last few years. And I forget the percentage of undergrads at Berkeley that take data science courses, but it's clearly majority across all majors. So I think there is a kind of growing sophistication in terms of programming skills and data skills, even among folks not majoring in computer science or not majoring in economics. And I know Berkeley's not alone in that. I'm sure it's the same at MIT.
Harvard is doing.
And Harvard
is doing that, something similar. And just this year is the first year that there is a requirement of gen ed courses that involve their data literacy, so across all disciplines that need to be taken, at least 2 of those. But they are embedded within different departments, but they have some aspects of that. That's one part. The other thing I was going to say also, for the institute where I am, in the quantitative social science, we provide workshops to help even further to do, some of the things that we're discussing here about transparency, about using R and Python, open source coding practices, and so. But this is a extra curriculum.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I meant the second part, which is those best practices. They need to be taught within the actual skills, right? So, but thanks a lot for the answers.
Yeah, and I can report from my own university as well. We also are creating a data science thing. There are also workshops and things like that are extracurricular. What is advancing less and is integrating it into curricula, because part of the extracurricular stuff is it might come too late, or you, as a student, you might not know that this is actually important because the dinosaurs didn't tell you, and things like that. So how to actually integrate it into the normal stream, where you might at least get exposed to it and realize, okay, these things are all important. Maybe I should go out and do a GitHub, and maybe I should go out and do a data camp or something like that to sort of go in deeper on these kinds of things. That is a bit of the challenge right now. So I have a constant discussion with DGS at my department about, hey, let's make this workshop compulsory for all the graduate students. And some years it works, and then the next year it's a different one and it doesn't work. And so it isn't a stable thing. I feel strongly that it should be, but we're biased here, so that's that.
Can I say one more thing, just the last thought on that? Like, we're using the term dinosaur, and I mentioned in my talk before, we ran this survey of, folks publishing in top journals and also graduate students, PhD students. And our theory going into that data collection was that we would see dinosaurs. We would see, the graduate students are probably way more progressive in terms of open science attitudes, what they want to adopt, than the publishing authors. And we find like exactly the same stated support, adoption of practices. Like, we didn't find the intergenerational divide we assumed. Like, we thought there were old dinosaurs and then poor graduate students being held down by the dinosaurs, and we didn't find that. Now, I'm sure there's anecdotes going one way or the other, but like in the data, as best we could collect it, as representative of samples we could collect, like your stage of career, it was more like certain people are into open science and into new tools and other people aren't. And there's plenty of graduate students or assistant professors that have very traditional views on these things. And I've even seen that in a place like Berkeley, which is sort of a hotbed of this stuff. So it's not just generational. It's a little bit of like one's mindset, personality. I don't know what's driving it. It's not strictly generational, at least in our data.
Could it be that those grad students work with the the ones that have less open science practice might just follow the practice
They're not
of
senior
the
enough
advisor,
to
right?
tell Ted. The grad students who don't like it aren't senior enough to tell Ted that they don't like it. But like the MIT professor who's tenured who doesn't like it, he's fully confident to tell Ted to go pound sand. So.
Yeah. But I think it's a nuanced picture that doesn't fit the character we hypothesize. Like, we even in our pre-analysis plan, like, we expect to see this difference. Well, it was more nuanced. So just to throw it out there.
So if I can also add to, in terms of the coding part, like all the RAs, or including myself, the problem is that I didn't know what the best practice were, because they belong to another science. I started economics. I did a lot of econometrics in my whole life there, but I never knew this was a best practice. Even here, when I was doing this presentation, I learned a lot of new terms. I have been trying to find, I was like, I'm not doing this. I am super interested, a high-techer, and I didn't know what were the practices, right? So if we can help, because it's belonging to another field, and, computer science and software developers already have done so much in terms of the code practices, why don't we just take what they have been perfected and just like make it available, and that people that are interested, are aware of them and can adopt them easily. But even for me, doing this presentation, I learned things, and I was like, I'm not doing this.
Following on Lupe's question, it would be interesting. So one thing from Dime Analytics that we've done is trying to do a good internal assessment of like what are the common problems that come up when we do these code reviews, when we do kind of pre-publication reviews, when we see, okay, what is it, matters of de-identification, but just also throughout the process of where are there coding inefficiencies, where are there coding errors that come up, what can we automate that help to reduce some of these errors. And I think it would be useful to hear if there's, kind of areas that, either from ODM or from, the AEA experience, are there parts of the process that you think should be further automated to, and just kind of tools created that would simplify then the ultimate, replication process?
So at ODM, we actually have a grant from the Sloan Foundation where we are trying to automate the reproducibility work that we do. And one of the things is instead of having these disparate systems, it's a system that we all can share, the authors and the editors and the curators and the verifiers. One thing that, in thinking about how to help authors that we've talked about is how to set up some just sort of code templates. Like if you're going to write a master script that would call in all of the subscripts that you use. And thinking through, the other issue we run into a lot that authors have a lot of problems with is for non-deterministic models, how to set a seed. And so that way you tell us the seed and then we can verify your results. And so it's just some things like that. And, there's a range in terms of our authors, in terms of their technical skills, I'd say. We have some that, can clearly do more of the, computationally advanced stuff. But then we have ones who are giving me their scripts in, like, Word documents. Because, they don't know how to write a do file or export it that way. So I don't know if you have...
I'm going to actually argue somewhat against what Cheryl was saying, and that part of that is there's an enormous diversity of analytical approaches. And so I'm always somewhat hesitant to sort of provide the one that rules them all, because it'll just be the n+1 that doesn't rule anything. It's just yet another variant on it. And that's a bit of a challenge. There are lots of flavors of doing it right by reproducible practices. There aren't just one way of doing it. And even if you go back into the computer sciencey world, you can type make and do stuff like that. And then somebody will come around and say, yes, but CMake is so much better. And all these other things. This is always going to be diverse and will necessarily be so. Because in some software, sometimes a single do file or a single M file or something like that won't do. There is a lot of guidance that can be provided in terms of templates on how you would actually do something like that. The replicable document templates are part of that, but they're also not the solution for all of it. Try running an R Markdown if you need 200,000 compute hours, and you'll probably freak out a bit. So having best coding practices, templates, a variety of these things out there, and telling people to find them or how to find them is, I think, one of the key aspects to it. There's a lot of responses from the trenches that are important. A second thing, and this only came to me recently as sort of surprise, when I saw from a to be unnamed, relatively well-established lab that has very robust and public replicability and training of the students that work in that lab. It turned out to be the first replication archive in a month that, from the start, did not work. So while this was totally replicable in the lab, the procedures were so complicated to actually set up and do that it failed utterly for the journal, because we didn't have any of the prerequisites. It wasn't easy to install the prerequisites. The prerequisites required lots of manual intervention. Once you had all that, you just typed make and everything worked. And they had not done their job in terms of converting it into the final version, that is the definitive version that goes with an article. So there actually is a bit of a tension between what works in a closed environment in a lab and what works for a replicator at a journal, that is essentially collapsing all that complicated structure into something that somebody who's not trained over hours or days or something like that on your particular flavor of lab procedures. There always is going to be a necessity for these lab procedures. And yet it needs to then take another step into becoming more reproducible down the road. Sometimes that process is relatively simple. A compute capsule from the start with public use data, etc. You provide the capsule, that's fine. But even if you go, say, into the Python world, and there's all these versions of Python that you need to worry about, and the environment that's set in there, and the whole thing was run on my lab computer, so I didn't actually use environments, or I didn't actually use these things. They're intrusive on the replicator when they weren't for your lab. And those are considerations that are only emerging. It's a kind of luxury to encounter these, but they're just as important, right? So imposing on the replicator, after you've done replicating this particular article, wipe your computer and start from scratch. While I may know that I can use a virtual machine to simulate that task, that is not the default setup of anybody. And if you'd used a virtual machine or a Docker or a CodeOcean or whatever initially, then the whole thing would have been simpler for everybody involved. And so there are considerations that go into this as well that are good problems to have to some extent, but that are challenging to also provide. Even a unique solution is going to be almost impossible to think about that.
Maybe I can add something to this conversation. So, I'm sort of a computer scientist. So I've done a lot of work with historical computing, and the past half-hour discussion has been fun to listen to, because many of you are making the assumption that using good tools will promote good practices. And that has not been my experience. The good tools can be really badly misused. Also, that the tools that you're using are here in a particular time, a particular technology basis. And many of these tools behave very differently if you're using them on Mac versus Linux versus Windows. I recently tried to get some Fortran code from the 1960s to work. And I had all the source code, right? It was one bloody program, and I couldn't find a Fortran compiler that would compile code Fortran from the 1960s. I got old Fortran compilers from the 1980s, and they wouldn't work. So if you are interested in building a historical record, something that people 20 years from now can also run, current thinking is virtual machines are the way to do that, right? But I have virtual machines from 10 years ago that won't run on the current version of VMware. And maybe if, it's like the virtual machine is depending upon things in the host VM system that are just not there. These are not solved problems. And you're trying to get from the tools what you're not getting from your discipline among your researchers. And that's probably a mistake. The tools can make it easier, but they're not going to be a substitute for good scientific practices.
I was in charge of the onboarding for a few years at Dime Analytics, and one thing that I realized when people come, like great graduates, recent graduates from great graduate programs, that they were very good critical thinkers about everything apart from their code. So I kind of want to agree with the two last speakers that there's plenty of tools out there, but you have to question, you have to keep you have to ask yourself, I should say, they're all built based on the same kind of questions. Is this good? Is this, why does this work? Like the same set of questions when you're evaluating a tool, if it's a good fit for you, they're all the same, but then there's a multitude of different things that's good. And I think that the best thing that I always try to do is like have people review each other's code. The same as like you have like an opponent to a paper, to a thesis or something like that. Have someone like set it up in a more playful environment, but like have someone criticize someone else's code. And I think that's the first time some of these this new RAs that came to me was like actually like try to qualitatively think about code. Like they're great critical thinker, but when I showed them a code example, they just accept this is how I do it. They would never do so with any theory or any economics or anything. But somehow, I think there's somewhere like in this data, like this is our main tool. It's becoming our main tool. It is our main tool, but we stop being critical thinkers about this code and the tools that we use. The tools are great, but we have to think critically about them.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's going to be the last word for today because we do have to wrap up and let people pick up kids, get home, and clean up the room. So thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been fantastic. The only last request is please don't leave a mess on your table. I think if there's dishes or anything, you could just put them just outside. It really helps the staff. Other than that, I'll be hanging around for a half an hour around here, just getting things straightened up, getting people out the door. If you have any questions, we're happy to pass contact details for people or put people in touch if you're not there already. Our email address is here on the screen, dimeanalytics@worldbank.org. That goes to several of us, and we triage them to make sure that the question goes to the best place. Like I said, if you want to get in touch with anyone who you saw or met today and aren't able to now for whatever reason, please let us know and we can reach out. If you have any other questions about what we or any of the groups do, that's the best way to do other than visiting the resource that they've sent before. And we'll hopefully have follow-up information and just any slides and stuff that we have posted. You can look forward to a blog post from us and cross-post, hopefully with some of the other groups here. And, yeah, thanks again. Thank you, everybody.